being recorded, and that also means that you can watch previous incarnations of our Salon-From-Anywhere on the Blue Sky YouTube channel at any time. For those of you who are new, welcome. For those of you who are returning, it is lovely to see you again. And the way that we do these is that I'm really not talking at you. I'm going to lead a discussion. And so you are welcome to share your thoughts at any point. And we do that two ways. Folks can type something into the chat if that's more comfortable for you, or you can use the raise hand feature, which if you scroll down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be something that says reactions. And when you hover over that or click on that, there's a raise hand feature. And if you can't make that feature work, just type in the chat, raise hand, and then we'll know that your hand is up. And we'll generally sort of call on people in a particular order, but it should be a great conversation. And we always start our programs by humbly acknowledging that Blue Sky Gallery, and indeed the space where I am right now, are on the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin and Kalapuya, Malala, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Wimal and Willamette rivers. And in this online format, we realize that you may be participating from other areas, so we invite you to consider your own land acknowledgement that reflects your location. We also want to acknowledge that this technology, which we rely on for these online programs, is inequitably distributed and not equally accessible, which creates new virtual displacements and exclusions. And we always want to call attention to the need for action now and in the future to address these past and current disparities. I love doing these salons. I loved when we were doing them in person in the gallery, but this allows folks to participate from further away and in different ways. But the reason that I started doing these at all is really just to create a sense of community by engaging around the photography and often around poetry, as we will do tonight. And the idea is that if you just go and look at the art and take it away with you, that's a nice thing. But if we can talk about it, we are actually building a sense of community and connection together. And not a right answer. There's certainly not an answer I'm looking for. The idea is that as all of us comment, we help each other see things in the photography and in the poetry that none of us would have seen all of together. And I never leave one of these sessions without having learned something myself. So that is the spirit in which I hope you will engage tonight. And given our topic, I thought that I might start with this question for us all to think about, is to maybe come up with what's a first memory that you have, or a particularly best memory or a particularly worst memory involving a highway. And what I'm looking for is really to try and think about a very specific highway memory that you have. So take a moment and think about those. And then if folks want to share, I would love to hear some of the things that come up for people, while I tuck in this curtain so that it doesn't blow into my face the whole time. So did folks have a first, best, or worst highway memory that anybody wanted to share?
I think Chris, you want to start us off?
Sure. When I was a kid, we lived in New York City, but we had a summer weekend place in Connecticut, which was actually the first residential geodesic dome. So it was about a 2-hour drive. And when we were driving back to the city at night on Sunday night, there was a little VW bus mattress in the back that I would sleep on, but I wouldn't want to sleep until we got past the drive-in, because I got to watch the drive-in for 4 seconds as we drove past it.
Excellent. I love that memory. Anybody else have any?
Robin?
I took a school bus off of Route 1. It's 3 blocks from my house in Linden, and there was a White Castle there, and there was always a sign that said that it was created in 1921, which was the year my father was born, and it was like a really big, dirty highway. And I had a friend that had a house there, and she had to keep her windows closed. But It was a dangerous place, but the White Castle was real cool, and the French fries were good.
I noticed you didn't mention the burgers. White Castle is known as murder burgers to people of a certain vintage and geography, I think.
My dog loved them. My Whippet loves little burgers.
Anybody else have a highway memory they want to share?
Let's see, Marvin, and then Chuck.
Okay, did you see my hand raised? I don't
Yeah.
know if that works.
Yeah, it's raised. It's great. It's raised.
Okay, when my family's had a summer home in Michigan since the early 1930s, and so I'm very old. And we started driving out. My earliest memories of highways, driving out in the 30s and 40s, it was a 5.5 hour drive. And so it's not a single memory, but it's a combination of memories of being in the car for a long time and seeing the highway go by year after year after year, the same highway. And actually now today it's a 2-hour drive, but that was when everything was a 2-lane country road. And that's what I remember highways as being. Then I also have to tell you something my daughter will never forgive me for. I used to tell my kids when they were little, we were driving out there to look for that blue line between states that they see on the map. and they were always looking out the window for that blue line. And then my daughter's almost 50. She still hasn't forgiven me.
Now we know that Marvin is a terrible person. Chuck, I believe you were up next.
Yeah, Chuck.
When I was a boy, we would drive up to visit relatives and along the northern coast of Newfoundland. And at the time, the highways were not paved, so it was dirt. So it was a 2-lane highway. You could probably go maybe like 30, 40 miles an hour tops. And it would create, when it was dry, huge clouds of dust out the back that would align with each of the rear wheels. So my sister and I would look out the back, and each of us would have our own, we call them ghosts, the sort of the piles of dust, and to see whose ghosts were winning, whose cloud of dust was larger.
These are so interesting because we've had many of these memories are about being young, being not the driver, looking out, seeing it, and the world that we invent in this kind of liminal, transitional space of the car. When I posed this question, I realized that one of my most positive highway memories is that I went to graduate school in Los Angeles. And so when you drive along the 10 freeway, which is the major east-west freeway in Los Angeles, I think in places called the Christopher Columbus Highway, which we could unpack that, the problematic nature of that being the name of that highway. But as you drive along and you're like, LA freeway, LA freeway, LA freeway, and you drive through Santa Monica, and then you go through one tunnel and you come out and you're driving along the coast on the way up to Malibu. And it seemed to me like that was the reward for putting up with everything else that you had to put up with in LA, that you just could go through this tunnel and suddenly the Pacific from the East Coast has opened up before you. Well, we're gonna take a look at what Joshua Dudley Greer thinks we should be looking at around some freeways to start. So I'm going to jump into sharing my screen. It'll take me a moment to make everything look pretty. All right, so this is our first image to look at. Take a moment or two with it. And my first question to you is, what is this a photograph? Oh, sorry. What is this a photograph of exactly? Is it a landscape? What is it? And when you're ready, either thoughts in the chat or raise your hand to share some ideas. Looks like Marvin's got a hand up.
Oh, Marvin, you're up. You're muted.
What strikes me first looking at that is an artificial mound. It looks like it. And that path around it is informal road. And I think that's some kind of dump. The freeway just seems to disappear in my mind looking at that.
Yeah, it's a strange vantage from which our photographer has chosen to shoot this, because it foregrounds this thing that, is it the thing that we're supposed to be looking at? Are we supposed to be looking at the freeway? I was told this guy does pictures of highways. What is that doing in our foreground? And looks like Chris is up next.
To me, my sort of initial hit on this is that it makes the land look like a body. It looks like sort of fleshy and strange lumps, and the way we all are.
And is that not just the part in the foreground, right? But all of the land.
Yeah, but that foreground lump is the point of the arrow.
Yeah.
Well,
Other
I see
thoughts?
I see it as this kind of interesting intersection of these forms, as everyone has sort of spoken to. And I'm familiar with I-5 right here through the Grapevine, which is not a fun drive, but it's definitely a thoroughfare. I mean, people have to, if they want to get from Northern California to Southern California, the quickest way, it's what you have to bypass this. So, but it's a question, is it a landscape, or is it the highway? What is it that we are, where is our eye drawn? I see more forms than I see what it actually is. Chuck?
I'd say I'm fascinated by the forms. I've been up and down the Grapevine a bunch of times, but it's also the highway is such a presence. It literally sort of cuts across from left to right. It kind of creates a sort of top and bottom of the image. And so you also just the sense of, you also see all the sort of motion blur of the vehicles as they're moving, in contrast to the staticness of the landscape.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about it that way. This idea of landscape is static, which of course it is not really in real life, but that photography, at least this photograph, can capture landscape in a different way than what happens with the traffic. And honestly, I feel like I can pick out trucks better than cars, for example. I can tell that there are cars by lights and motion, but trucks are easier forms to pick out, even because they're larger in the photograph.
Barbara?
Oh, you're muted, Barbara.
You're muted, Barbara.
The thing I keep coming back to is the way that rocky stuff is falling onto that, white ring around the mound. And so it looks like, that to me, it makes you think about the power of the landscape there, and how hard it would be to build something in that landscape that just, the things that are always falling off of the mountains on it. And, I don't know what that is, if that's a road that's around it, but it doesn't look, used or passable in this photograph. So I don't know, that was what I kept coming back to, that slag heap. If it was on the East Coast, I would think it was some kind of mining thing, but I don't know, not here.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. I don't know whether it is a natural formation or whether it might be whatever they moved out of the way to build the highway. It is interesting how, like, we so want to know what that white track around it is, because we want to read things through what we're familiar with, and the part that's clearly the highway we're familiar with. Wanting to know. Does Chuck have his hand up again?
I think Chuck does. Go for it, Chuck.
I was just talking about this hill, we're also thinking about like the highway. There's a whole bunch of vehicles on it, and they're sort of going somewhere. They're going from the, either, if you know the area, it's from Northern California to Southern California, but also from the left of the picture to the right. And it's all this action, and it's in it's in up and down or left and right, but it's very linear. And then the hill that it's near is just sort of, it kind of meanders like a little park road, and there's nothing on it. And it's sort of like, you think, what's the purpose of it?
Yeah, and I think also, I don't 100% know that I would have recognized this as being near the grapevine if I wasn't told that in the title or the caption of the photo. But I have such deep associations with the grapevine because I went to graduate school in Los Angeles, having lived in San Francisco before that, so traveled that stretch many times. So it's either the excitement and anticipation of setting out on the trip, or the sense of like, okay, we're finally close to home, of the return of the trip. So it's also a very, it's amazing how much emotion to think back to people's, the number of people who kind of conjured up childhood memories and the emotion that we put around our time on particular freeways. Any more thoughts on this one before we go on to the next image?
Let's see, C has their hand raised.
So I think the scale is super interesting in this picture because I'm drawn to that mound, but I think it's smaller than it is. But then I look at the cars and realize how small the cars and the trucks are. And then I look at the mountains behind and I'm like, wow, those gotta be huge. But then I'm coming back to the mound being like, well, how big is this mound? I don't know. I feel like I'm really shifting into the different like scale, and I think because of his vantage point, it's a little, I don't know, a little mind-boggling, which is cool.
Yeah, and save that question about scale, because I think that will come up in some of these other images. I'll offer a few more thoughts before we depart from this one. One of which is the weirdness of this being called the grapevine, since that's a term from nature, right? Grapevines, but clearly this has nothing to do. It's not like you're seeing vineyards on the side of the road, right? The way that we extract from nature to create a name for what is totally not nature, what is cutting through nature. And I will also say about the hills of Southern California, we referred to them when we lived there as the opening sequence of MASH, because that was where I first saw these hills, was that it was pretending to be Korea in the opening sequence of the TV show MASH, right? It's that I had seen week after week in my childhood. So it's also interesting how we read even the nature through the fakeness of the culture, which is what encapsulates Southern California better than saying fakeness and culture in one sentence. All right, let's go take a look at the next image. So we might ask the same question about, what is this a photograph of exactly? Is this a landscape? Is it, how would you describe it, or what strikes you about the composition of this image?
Chris?
Well, that it's somebody occupying a space that's sort of intended to be, unnoticed and non-existent, and oh yeah, never mind that, and somebody is failing to never mind that, and therefore has a nice big space with plenty of sticks to work with. And a stream.
Yes. Like, if we didn't have these two ginormous pillars, we might read this really differently. The house and the landscape alone versus just what those pillars imply we would be experiencing if we were in the space. Other thoughts?
Robin, you have your hand?
There's a man in there, right? He's wearing red. So
Oh, yeah.
there's a whole proportion thing, but he's probably under some sort of like thoroughfare as well. So those pillars really play with your mind about proportion. And obviously he's lived there a long time, and he's like some sort of carpenter, and he's out of sight but insight as well. I mean, it's a really good find.
and of
Josh.
course, right, assuming that we are looking at what's underneath the freeway, to think about how many people pass over this spot on any given day or week or month or year with no idea of the way that that same space is being inhabited.
Yeah.
Chuck, did you have something to say?
I would say also it's kind of a pastoral scene with this little babbling brook and the little three-legged stool under the tree on the left of the image.
Oh yeah.
And you think it looks like the photograph is taken from what might be the driveway of whatever this building is. But I don't know if it's a home or just like a shop that someone's building things in. Like the roof is metal and looks very new, right? So it's not, it's disorganized in some ways, and yet the wood is sort of stacked in certain ways. You really wonder like what this space is. And the other thing that strikes me is that we're in a valley, that those two piers that are holding up, whether it's a highway or whether it's a railway or probably a highway, this must be in a valley, that there's a bridge bridging something to the left and something to the right, the hills that we don't actually see. There's a hill sort of as we look back into the image, but not a hill. You can sort of see the beginnings of the hill on the left. So it's this sort of nestled in, as I think someone said, it's sort of nestled and not exactly hidden, but out of the way.
You have to know to look for it,
Yeah.
that it's in order to find it. Marvin?
I took these columns to be part of the support of the highway. And so what we're seeing is what you're not allowed to see when you drive by. This doesn't exist for you when you're going through the hills in North Carolina. Basically that's it. This is a world and life that are hidden away from us. And it's a different form of life. It's less, it doesn't have a car parked there. So it's less prosperous, possibly. It's rougher, more difficult. And we are to drive right past it without knowing it's there, or understanding why it's there, or what the implication of our not being able to see it is. It's a form of life that doesn't exist for us in our normal everyday world.
Yeah, I think there's an implication of local vehicles because we can see tracks in that dirt area, but certainly whether it's the photographer's choice or whether it's what's there that day, we aren't seeing a vehicle. Chris, did you have an observation?
Yeah, I was going to say, talking about this makes me think about, there's a Robert Frank photograph in The Americans that's the aftermath of a car accident, and there's two people sort of lying by the side of the road with a sheet over them, and there's some local people kind of looking at them, and we've been talking about, you know, that this guy with the red shirt is the invisible guy, but I think it could be more logically argued that the people zooming by overhead are the invisible people, and that he's the local person going, oh, these weird buzzing out cars had people in them. Here are some and they're dead.
Right, or at least they don't even know what this place really is. I know this place. Ken has observed in the chat that, you know, the building may be older than the roof. We really don't know in terms of a chicken and the egg what has happened. And Robin, we may be disappointing you because Joshua is actually doing his talk tomorrow night. This is a different program than that. You can stay, you can come back tomorrow. You can do both, or you can leave. I won't be hurt.
There's another talk tomorrow.
Yeah.
That, castle, a fellowship talk.
Okay. I feel like also I was going to say something when people were talking about scale and the enormity. Like, it's interesting to think about infrastructure in this photograph. The house is a kind of infrastructure, but on a totally different scale than the freeway or the highway. And while I was living in Los Angeles, there was a new highway that was built in the city. And I remember as it was being constructed thinking, this is what this is America's cathedrals, our highways at these sort of big soaring scales like cathedrals in Europe. Not to say we don't have actual religious cathedrals here, but just thinking about what it means to put something on this scale on the landscape. Any more thoughts on this photo before we leave it?
There were some comments in the chat, Lois. I don't know if you saw.
Yeah, I think I caught them.
You
I mean,
cover
there was
those?
there was this
Yeah.
question about which is we can't tell what predates what in terms of the highway versus the building, just as we can't really tell much about, is this somebody's home? Is it a workshop? Is it, I don't know, maybe it's my fishing shed. All right, well, as promised, we're going to look at some poetry as well. So this is the first poem. A velvet chair, a chair on a highway on a rainy afternoon. A velvet chair standing by itself on a highway. A chair standing by itself on a highway means its life is over. A life of ups and downs before it was brought here and left beside the grass. Nevertheless, it was laid down squarely, maybe, thanks to a final gesture of love, with all four legs standing against the asphalt. This rushes an image to my mind, a wandering soul who leisurely sits here between the passing cars and the mud. But really, no soul can be so foolish to come and sit on a torn, old, abandoned chair on a dark, cold, rainy September afternoon on a lightless highway. Or, to give the chair a little consolation, I conclude as follows. There exists such a soul, just that he or she is not here, not now. So we have this odd little poem, and maybe a place to start with this poem is in the repetition in those first lines. A velvet chair standing by itself on a highway, a chair standing by itself on a highway. What is the effect on us of having that repetition in those lines?
Chris?
Well, I would say the effect for me is to make me sort of stop trying to find out what's going on and just think about it as an image, and this chair just there, and it's like, okay, I'm going to have you explain it to me, but first let me just groove on it.
Yeah, indeed. This poem reminds me of some of you may know the Carlos Williams poem about the red wheelbarrow, right? It wants to create an image, I think, more than a narrative. Marvin, did you have some thoughts?
Oh, you're muted, Marvin.
Unmute is in a different place on this screen. It personalizes the chair for me. Suddenly I look at it as having a characteristic. It's personalized by repeating it. I say now this thing is there, and now this thing has a presence that's different than just saying it's there.
Yeah, that word presence is I think, a good way to capture what it's doing. Yu Yang?
I think the use of repetition of these two lines is to catch, to emphasize the fact that there's a chair on the highway, and also by repeating this line, it also catches readers' attention, as if, because when I read this poem, I was imagining from the perspective of a passenger or a driver who's on the highway. And I saw the chair, maybe for a second, maybe for a half second. I might remember it. I might not. So I think it's really using the repetition is really to trying to catch a moment that will be otherwise passing by really quickly and it won't be remembered by anybody.
Right. So I think all these comments sort of coalesce nicely together, that it emphasizes something about the chair. It makes its presence really strongly felt. It tells us that this is a sort of a poem that's about the imagery around this chair, but also is that it's also slowing us down as we think we're cruising down the highway of the poem. We're stopping and really seeing what we're looking at. So more broadly, what is this poem about, or what is it conveying to you as we look at it?
Chuck?
It's the chair sort of takes on human qualities, this object that people sit on, which we associate, the chair is obviously associated with the human body because it is used by a human body, but it's as if the chair is its own person and has its own sense of feelings and loneliness that you really are not about a chair at all. They're really about how we feel about emptiness or loneliness.
Right, the life is over is about the chair, but also it has received a final gesture of love, that somebody has set its legs down so carefully. And that wandering soul is supposed to belong to a human who sits in this chair, but it does make us think about the soul of the chair, particularly because the speaker in the poem then goes on to offer the chair a little consolation, right? I don't want to leave that chair alone and unloved at the end of its life. I want to offer it the idea that there is a soul who will occupy it, who will bring its life back, just not here right now. Marvin, were you going to jump in?
Yeah, I like what Chuck said. But I keep looking at the end of this poem, and there exists such a soul just as he or she is not here. He could have stopped there. It's not here. Chair's empty. But then he says, not now. Well, now that pushes us out of the poem into the possibilities of what does it mean that there's someone, are they coming back?
Mm-hmm.
Did they leave and they're not coming back? Where are they if they're going to come back? Did they take a break? Is there some metaphysical meaning to that? It's a soul. Does a soul evaporate and then come back together? That's just a puzzle, and it's interesting because it pushes you out past the end of the poem. Now you're wondering what's going to happen. I'm wondering, well, if not now, when and why? Those are all questions that come up because he did not stop at the words "not here."
And I will say there was a little debate in our household when I was picking poems for tonight's session about whether the end of this poem, a certain person thought the end of this poem was sort of a sad or at least bittersweet. And I actually think the end of this poem is quite hopeful, right? It is the consolation to know there exists such a soul, even if that soul is not here, not now. But of course, I'm not sure that the poem dictates a hopeful feeling. I think that there is, that's an interpretation. Molly, why don't you tell us what you mean? And I see there's some debate about, or some question about who PK is, and I'll get to that in a moment. But Molly, when you say you read this as a metaphor for what?
Yeah, I think, as Chuck has alluded to, the chair is like a stand-in for a human, a presence. But I think it's an interesting juxtaposition of this on a busy high, the image on a busy, oftentimes busy highway. And so I feel like this poem is about life passing us by, perhaps, as cars pass very quickly on the highway, and maybe it's a matter of sitting down and taking a moment to reflect and think, and having that opportunity to have a chair offered to you, to sit down on that cold and rainy September afternoon, when you might contemplate life. So yeah, I see it as not literal in my experience in any way.
So, and I think, you know, we probably all had that experience. If you're in some space and you see a chair that implies somebody comes here regularly to sit, it's on somebody's fire escape or on the roof of a building or tucked someplace that you don't expect, and just thinking about what it means that somebody chooses this place for their contemplative sit sometime. Barbara, were you going to jump in with a thought?
The ending makes me think that the poet is identifying with the chair themselves. And so when they say, you know, they want to give the chair a little consolation and conclude that, oh, someone's going to come along, not here, not now. It's like somebody giving themselves a little pep talk. That was kind of my interpretation of it.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. And I think that's part of maybe why I found the ending to be a positive ending, or a hopeful ending, I guess I should say, and not such a bittersweet ending, is because of that, that sense of the speaker of the poem, who may or may not be the same as the poet, but the speaker of the poem wanting this to be a consolation to the self, right? As you said, I'm pretending that I want to console the chair, but come on, the chair's not reading the poem, and the chair isn't going to experience consolation anyway because it's an inanimate object. It is about what the speaker of the poem is projecting on the chair, and therefore what it leads us to project and to take from the chair. There's been a bit of a back and forth in the chat about who PK is. So those of you who've been to my salons before know that I am very much one about, like, let's just look at whether it's a photograph or a poem, the thing that we're looking at, and not try and figure out who made it and what meaning they imbued it with, because in some ways these are conversations about the effect of the work on us. But I will say that this PK is a pretty mysterious creature, and I could find almost nothing about this person who's chosen to go just by initials, and therefore is very difficult even for an expert cyber stalker such as myself to learn much about. Eugenia has put up some text that appears in the place where I found this poem on the internet, but it's interesting how much we want to know more about the person as though that is going to tell us what we're supposed to think about the poem, whereas I find letting the poem, I was going to say wash over me, but now I want to find a more highway adjacent metaphor for letting the poem rush past us, and seeing what we see out the window onto the poem. Okay. Marvin, did you have something else you wanted to say about this? I don't know if your hand is up anew or if that's a legacy from before.
That's from before.
Okay. If we think about the slide that came before this, when you think about this image and this poem together, does anything resonate from the combination or the juxtaposition of them that you might not have thought about otherwise? Ken has said stillness and movement. I'm not sure, I don't know, Ken, if you want to unmute, because I'm not quite sure I understand the comment. Oh, both the poem and the image contrast movement with stillness, so that you're sort of seeing a commonality between them. And Chuck, did you have something you wanted to?
Sorry. that both of them are sort of, well, first of all, both of them have cars that are may or may not be noticing the objects in them. So there's the car that's rushing on or we assume there's cars above the house or shop or whatever that building is, as well as the passing cars that are going on either side of the chair. Really, that this object, whether it's the house or the chair, is sort of not that important to the sort of busy life or the passage of traffic that's moving around it or over it, but it still has some sense of being, or even if it's disorganized or kind of crappy, it's something that has a soul unto itself.
Yeah. Any more thoughts on this poem before we go on?
One thing that I, in looking back at the image after reading this, and someone had mentioned this in talking about the image itself, was kind of the hidden nature of say living or working underneath a highway or an overpass. And I think together with the poem, it reminds me to kind of take a closer look about those things that we might dismiss, and maybe that was something Chuck was referring to as well too, but and to pay attention a little bit more closely to see those evidences of life around us or hidden in secret underneath places.
All right, I'll take us to our next item, which is another poem. Freeway 280, and I have to try and move things around on my screen. Zoom is covering up a little bit of this poem, so I might need a little help. Las casitas near the gray cannery, nestled amid wild abrazos of climbing roses and man-high red geraniums, are gone now. The freeway conceals it all beneath a raised scar. But under the fake wind sounds of the open lanes, in the abandoned lots below, new grasses sprout, wild mustard remembers, old gardens come back stronger than they were. Trees have been left standing in their yards. Albaricoqueros, cerezos, nogales. Viejitas come here with paper bags to gather greens. Espinaca, verdolagas, yerba buena. I scrambled over the wire fence that would have kept me out. Once I wanted out, wanted the rigid lanes to take me to a place without sun, without the smell of tomatoes burning on swing shift in the greasy summer air. And I can't read the next line.
Maybe it's here.
Maybe it's here, en los campos extraños de esta ciudad, where I'll find it, that part of me mown under like a corpse or a loose seed. What is this poem about, my friends? What is this poem about?
Well, I think it's about finding life in that which has been discarded or abandoned, and finding hope and maybe a renewed appreciation for a place that was at one, somehow sentimental and is coming back stronger. Barbara.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think I'm reading this poem differently because we looked at the photograph before it. And to me, they're both about resilience in a way. I mean, the guy with his sticks in this everywhere under a freeway, you can just hear the noise, I mean, it's just dirty and noisy. And then there's this guy with his piles of things, building things. And then here, this poem about how the things continue to grow and the garden comes back, and maybe he's going to find himself there in this, you know, place that's without the sun and some part of himself. I don't know. That's how I read it, that it was about resilience.
Yeah, I mean, here we know which came first, the casitas or the freeway, right? That the casitas have been sort of scarred over by the freeway, but these abandoned lots below, new grasses sprout. Wild mustard remembers. It's such a great line. Wild mustard remembers. And then it's not just that nature is there, but viejitas, the old ladies are coming back to gather their greens in what, again, any of us rushing by on the freeway might not notice as a space or might think of as a discarded or desolate space, but is actually a place where greens grow, and when, if you know what to do, you can gather sustenance. I'm interested in what is the relationship between the I who is speaking in this poem and what they are speaking about. What are they thinking about the things that they are describing?
Barbara, do you have your hand up again, or is that from before? Oh, that's okay. I'll put it down. Chris?
Well, I think it's somebody younger than the old ladies who was like, get me out of this, out into the larger world, and the freeway is my ticket out. And now they're not sure that they want to get out.
Or they've gotten out and now want to come back in, right? I scramble over the wire fence that would have kept me out, right? So everybody's supposed to be kept out by the fence, but once I wanted out, now I'm not just anybody who's being kept out by the fence, but somebody who was on this other side, wanted the rigid lanes to take me to a place without sun, without the smell of tomatoes burning. I'm like, what is that? Oh, right. We're next to a great cannery, without the smell of tomatoes burning on swing shift in the greasy summer air, right? So the thing that defines the place that you're from is so such a visceral sensory response, right? Because it's the smell, but also the feel of it, the greasy summer air, which is maybe greasy from the cannery, but maybe greasy because I live really close to the freeway, because that's where people with not a lot of money get stuck. And yet now, once I want it out implies maybe not now, right? And where I'll find it, that part of me. Chuck, your hand is up. What were you thinking?
I'm just kind of intrigued in terms of what the person is feeling or looking by the last two lines where we're talking about, you know, finding that part of you mown under like a corpse or a loose seed. And they're sort of opposites. I mean, a corpse is the end of a life, and the seed is the beginning of a new life. And yet, you know, there's a Whitman poem about bodies that are buried who become the compost to grow new life, that this made me think of, that there's sort of these possibilities for either the end or of the beginning, but in each case, the person, either whether it's a corpse or a seed, is part of the landscape and part of the world.
Yeah, and when you were speaking, I was thinking about, I'm totally blanking on the name of the photographer. Chris will tell me in a moment, as soon as I reveal, where we were looking at the blood in the ocean from the whale kill.
Oh, Keely.
Keely, right.
Yeah.
And Emily Dawson, who was one of the participants that evening and who grew up in Alaska and has a different relationship to hunting and fishing than many of us who grew up in other places, said, well, when you look at that blood, and people were sort of horrified to look at the blood, and she said, it's great. It means that some people are going to get sustenance from the flesh of the whale, but there's much of the ocean life that will get sustenance from the blood of the whale, right? So again, this idea that corpse or seed seem to us on one level to be in opposition, but in fact, in nature, that's not the case, that death is what brings about and sustains new life. And it looks like Eugenia has sort of complemented some of what we're saying in the chat by saying, yeah, the speaker in the poem wanted to escape this place and to a different place, a place without sun, which is such a funny thing, right? All of us who escaped to California, we wanted to escape to the place with sun, but to want to escape to the place without sun, and now coming back to find a part of oneself. Other thoughts about this poem? Other things we haven't covered in this poem?
Well, in some ways, I think it's like what we all experience as we grow up and we mature and we have renewed outlooks on our past. And in many ways, we might want to go back and retrieve that, but we see things as we grow up through a different lens and perspective. And I think that's sort of what's happening here to this person.
And like, I feel like I was allowed to put this poem in here because of the title, Freeway 280. But what is the title doing for the poem? How does it frame our reading of this poem? I mean, literally, it's the first part that we read, so it sets us up. But what kind of, is it setting expectations that the poem fulfills? Is it setting expectations that the poem sort of does a switcheroo on us for? How is it framing your reading of the poem that it's called Freeway 280?
Chuck?
I think in all of these, I mean, all of the pictures that we've seen, the freeway is this kind of essential part, and it's about motion and circulation. But everything is also, both in the poems and in the images, is also about the things that are around it that you wouldn't normally notice. I mean, I think other people have said the same thing, but it seems to be this sort of through line through all the both images and words that we've seen.
Yeah. Other thoughts about the title? Marvin?
I come from the Midwest, where we would call this an interstate, and a freeway is a very different kind of description. It inflates not just that this is a road that goes somewhere, but this is a way to freedom. So I noticed the difference because I'm from the Midwest, and it's an interesting way of looking at a road. It's a way to freedom. It's not an interstate, it's not a highway. It's not elevated in any way like that. And just that, those two words together mean something totally different to me. Although now I've lived here long enough, I say freeway and I think it's normal. I go home and I say freeway and people say, what's that?
Right. What's wrong with you, Marvin? Well, so, and a freeway, etymologically comes literally from meaning that it's not a toll road, right? And I grew up near a road that was called the Turnpike, right? And a turnpike is literally a toll road that there used to be a big pike that they would put, and only after you paid your toll would they turn the pike and you could go and proceed. But I think that you're right that we use it now. There are, in a way that implies that sense of freedom is captured. I also suspect Freeway 280 is in Northern California, and I suspect that there are a lot of people who know that road, but don't know what's underneath the scar of the road, right? That it's a way to sort of call out and say, here's what you've been passing on this particular, the place is really specific and important, I think. It would be a different framing, I would say, if it were called Under the Freeway as opposed to Freeway 280. There's something very specific about the geography, which is about somebody for whom this is a personal geography. Any final thoughts on this poem before we move on?
Well, this is the same. This also refers to that picture of the home or workshop under a highway, it basically is saying the same thing. Here's something the road passes by. This is something you don't have to look at. And I think that's an important part of those things. You don't have to look at it, so you don't know it's there. So you don't know what it means. So you have no appreciation for it, or what it means to the people who live there, or why it exists the way it does. You can just go past it. It's free. Your way is free.
Even though for somebody else it's so incredibly laden with both memory and meaning and a sense of self. Barbara, what was your thought? Wait, you have to, yeah.
There we go. It's so interesting to me because you talk about the turnpike. I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I've lived on the West Coast here for just, you know, since the 1990s. And I think my idea of what a freeway is really different. Like when you asked us earlier about, you know, memories, I mean, I'm thinking about the Howard Johnsons that I used to eat at the hamburger. And, you know, it's just so different out here. When I think about here, the freeway, I think about hours of driving. And it's a very interior space for me because often I mean, I've had a lot of long distance things where I had to go back and forth between Bellingham every weekend and this kind of thing. And so it's hours of like interior space. And I don't know, I just never thought about that before. Thanks for, you know, putting these things together because it made me realize like people in different parts of the country have different ideas. And when whoever it was in the Midwest said it's all about freedom in his mind, to me, the freeways are very interior spaces because of the time in the car. We spend hours on the West Coast in cars driving, you know? So that was interesting. Thank you.
Sure. I'm going to have us look at another photo or two. We'll see how long you all want to stick around. So here's another image. Think about what you notice right away in this picture and what it takes you time to notice as you look at the picture. So what are some of the things that strike you? Chris?
Well, that it seems to be a family who have just become homeless, but that if they've just gotten evicted, they haven't gotten evicted from a residential neighborhood. This is a, you know, gas station kind of freeway off-ramp kind of a place.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how quickly we want to create narrative around this, right? Like, how did they come to be here and where are they headed? Begs us to come up with stories that we cannot possibly know how right or wrong they are. I mean, it could also be that they were on their way someplace and their vehicle broke down, but they are not where we expect them to be with the stuff that they have around them. Chuck, what were you going to say?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I certainly would agree with Chris. Like this area looks like part of like a commercial district where you can see this, you know, maybe that's a restaurant, maybe it's a mall. There's definitely what looks like a gas station. If they're homeless, they look more like they're traveling than homeless, although they may be homeless. The bags are very meticulously packed, right? Everything's zipped up, everything's ready to go. It looks like they're on their way somewhere and you don't know what the sort of you don't know what the circumstances are. And then there's just this moment where the person wearing the cap appears to be playing with a phone or an iPad with the child. If you look kind of closely, so you just wonder like, what is this moment? And it's also kind of a domestic scene, right? There doesn't look to be any fear or freaking out, like, well, they're just playing with the iPhone and the other grown-up woman is holding the baby. And I mean, it just seems like it's this sort of little family scene in a way. It seems almost normal.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really striking is I feel like I'm looking at two different adults who, I don't know that these are their children, but I'll use the verb parenting, who are actually doing a good job of parenting, right? One child, both of the children are being held by these adults, and they are the center of the adults' attention. And they are trying to give these kids something that they need. In one case, it might be distraction. And in the one case, it's a little bit hard to tell whether that child is nursing or being fed in some way or is just being held, but that they are, their needs are being centered and attended to in a way that does seem like a lovely domestic scene, except that it's totally wrong for it to be happening in this space. Marvin, what were you going to say?
A lot of what I want to start out with has already been said, but I just point out that there's nothing shabby about any of this. Someone mentioned that everything looks either new or well cared for. And so these are people who have, maybe they're just waiting to be picked up by someone else who's going to drive them somewhere. We don't know, but just without repeating everything that's been said before, I was struck by the fact that everything is new or well cared for, and well organized. It's not in disarray. It's a domestic scene in the wrong place.
We can read a little bit of class here, I think, right? I don't know whether you can see it in the slide, but the juice bottle, and again, that you have juice because you've got the kids, is like Kirkland, right? Which is a generic store brand that you get at Costco or similar. So they're not fancy people. They don't have matching luggage, but it's tidy, it's clean, as people have been saying, and they do seem to be in some liminal space. I mean, really, like, even if you think about, they're in this island, so there's a driveway is not the right word, but this is a paved entry to something on one side and road on the other, which is not a place that people are usually occupying. So maybe they are waiting for a ride. It is possible that they were in transit and their car broke down, or somebody rear-ended them or whatever, and they are now waiting for a ride or waiting for something. But we've caught them at this particular interesting moment. All right, Eugenia's notes in the chat, they might have taken a bus and now they're waiting for whoever they're coming to see to come pick them up, or even for whatever vehicle they may have called to take them to wherever they're going. I also think compositionally, this is a really interesting picture because one of the things that strikes me is about the way color is working in here, right? There's blues and reds in the blanket, in what looks like the blanket that's wrapped around the woman. It looks like maybe another blanket that's over what's probably a stroller. And then the blue, I could name, but I don't need to do corporate promotion, the stripe of the gas station that's in the background of the picture. And similarly, there's sort of a rust colored red, I would say, in the restaurant behind them, but also red in one of the pieces of luggage, and maybe red also on the fruit juice container. Are there other things that strike you compositionally about this photograph that we haven't paid attention to yet? Oh, and Ken said, yeah, that triangle of reds. Oh yeah, there's red up here too. Chris?
That triangle of dirt that they're on almost feels like the bow of a ship, kind of, and the road is sort of water.
Yeah. Yeah, they're cast adrift in some way, perhaps, but also how nicely it tells you where foreground ends in the photograph.
Marvin, did you have another comment? Marvin? No.
I didn't have my hand up,
Okay.
but I'm just noticing how all the angles that intersect give a motion to this. And it's all going away from this family. There's the triangle they're in, there's the road which intersects the driveway, it is an angle.
Yeah.
It's moving away from these people.
Yeah. Or maybe it's also implying that they're going to be moving away, right? That this is, as we said, we can tell that they're not meant to be there long, right? And certainly we see people on the side of the road who you can tell have been and or will be there for a long while. And that's not what we're seeing here, that there's a emotion implied, interesting to compare to what we were saying about the poem earlier. Barbara, what was your thought?
I was just thinking about how tucked in everything is. It's like you have this wrapping of the woman with the baby, and then there's this wrapping of the stroller that you don't know what's inside that. And the way that the whole thing just kind of is this little nest in the middle of the frame with the suitcases. And then, you know, the man, the way he's wrapping his arm around the woman. Whoops. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think nest is such a lovely word to use to describe it, to think about. It's not smothering, it's the opposite. It feels like things are as they should be. Things are well held. I mean, does this photograph belong in this body of work that's supposed to be about freeways or highways? I can't remember what word Joshua uses. Eugenia points out in the chat, there are no cars here. This is the first one of the images where we've really seen people very clearly. They've been figures or the implication of human inhabitants in the other photos. But here where we see people, we don't see any cars. There might be one in the gas station in the background, or I guess there are a few parked and one at the pump at least. But, and Ken has said, well, it underscores the empty, soulless space created by our car culture. Although I think, yeah, that they are a contrast to that, particularly in what we were saying about the domestic kind of nurturing. The why include the beer sign? That's a good question, Marvin. I have my answer to it, but I want to see if anybody else has a possible answer to it. I see Chris's hand is up.
Well, just an answer to your earlier question about, I think it does have to do with the highways, because this looks to me very much like where you get off the freeway to get gas and beer and whatever, you know. But there's I think there's the sense that these people are not, that they're displaced. They're in the course of being in transit from one living situation to another, but they're not being displaced locally. If someone's going to pick them up from, you know, 4 blocks here to 8 blocks there, they would pick them up at the house. They wouldn't pick them up at an island of dirt. You know? So I think these people have come off the freeway, or as somebody suggested, their car broke down or whatever on the freeway. So I think these are, this is like the picture behind me that I alluded to earlier, the Robert Frank one, of these people on the freeway actually exist, and they have become corporal as they stepped out of the car. When we were in Tanzania on the wildlife safari, you were fine as long as you stayed in the Land Rover. And if you stepped out of the Land Rover, somebody would eat you. You're invisible while you're in it.
I think you mean something, not somebody, I hope. I don't know who the other tourists were outside your Land Rover.
Depends if you think animals are people or not.
I will call out a few of the things that have come out in the chat. Marvin sort of asked, why is the beer sign there? And I think in some ways compositionally, it's interesting because it picks up the yellow in the yellow lines on the road. I also am interested in it because it says craft beer, which tells you that craft beer is now so generic a concept that it is printed out on big canvas signs that appear in whatever, you know, not particularly fantastic restaurant we might expect to find in this setting. And then Ken said, you know, seeing them, we keep asking, where is their car? And that is such a revealing comment, because it is so true that we are so, I think, pulled into car culture and the identification with cars as Americans Yeah, and I'm an avid bicycle commuter, but that we expect a car around these people, and we want to wrap them in it in the same way that they are actually wrapped in each other or in their blankets. I'm going to jump us on to the next image. And on this one, I'm going to ask you to, like, as quick as you can, think about what your initial emotional reaction is to the photo rather than taking time to really soak it in. So take a quick emotional response to this one. And feel free to produce those, to articulate those emotional responses quickly, since I asked for them to be quick ones. Molly, why don't you go first, you giggler?
Oh, well, no, I emotionally, and I've seen, you know, so I've seen this picture before, obviously, but I see it as like sort of something that, you know, we see a kind of tragedy or something unfolding on the highway, and it's that that sort of rubbernecking and that that curiosity that comes, and it's not, it's like what I'm projecting onto, like what these people here are they're going to sit there and wait to see what unfolds. But yeah, it's almost not uncommon, maybe, is what I would say is my reaction. It's yeah.
Anybody else have quick hit emotional reactions before we go deeper into analyzing it? Chris, what were you gonna, what's your emotion?
Basically the same as Molly, that's an emotional distance. I'm not completely sure that that's not their car. But
Right.
in any case, there's a looking at it from an emotionally distant place is my emotional hit.
Ben in the chat wants there to be marshmallow vendors, I presume, so that we could roast them over the flaming car. Chuck, what was your thought?
I mean, from an emotional standpoint, to be totally honest, there's that little bit of sort of fascination and kind of attraction to the crash or to a disaster. And you see that maybe with the sort of the leisurely pose of the people on the banks of the freeway, like, oh, there's a disaster. Let's just gawk at it for a while. And it's not, I'm not saying that's good, but that's sort of the emotional reaction that I'm having.
Yeah. So I'm going to have us look at this photo another way, which is that I've put this horrible little grid on it. And I wanted to do this in part because I think you can now sort of imagine if this photo were cropped either so that it was any one of these particular rectangles, or maybe if you took off the whole top row, took off the whole bottom row, took off the two top rows, the two bottom rows, the one side, one column on one side, one column on the other side, like all the ways that you could slice and dice this photo just around where I've put these lines. When you start to look at the photo as I've I don't know, I was going to say eviscerate, that's not the right word, but as I've sliced and diced it up, what do you notice now, or what would happen if indeed we were to crop this photo in some way in particular? What would strike us differently about it? Oh, sorry. And Chuck, is your hand up anew, or is it a legacy hand?
Well, one of the things I noticed in the cropping, just going back to like my visceral reaction, is that the way that the spectators on the side of the road are now isolated, and it further emphasizes this kind of spectator moment. If you take them out, as I'm, you know, moving my hand over them, and it's a different feeling without those two audience members there.
And I think also if you took, if you cropped this photo, again, to take out the sort of bottom row that I've created of three rectangles, it also feels really different because we lose so much of this photo, actually, it turns out, is greenery. Mm-hmm. And it does feel weirdly different to take that out, which is really a way of saying, what is the effect of the way this photo has been composed for us? Chris, what are you thinking?
Well, when my publisher did my rephotographing AtJ book, they were disturbed that my rephotographs weren't exactly the same aspect ratio as the AtJ ones. So I was shooting in 35mm and he was shooting in a more squarish format. And so they kept trying to crop out the sidewalk off the bottom. And I
What you got wrong, you mean? Yeah.
And I had to go back in and say, you know, it's not about any objects that are on that sidewalk. It's about that the sidewalk gives the viewer a place to stand, so that you're standing in the scene, not just looking at a building that's somewhere off in the distance.
Right.
And I feel like this is the space that's around, even though this is a picture with two distinct focuses, that there's all this sort of open space that lets you kind of control your own gaze and be a participant in the scene rather than somebody who's just being shown an image.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, purposefully sort of created that middle row so that everything freeway is there, and it underscores how much more the photographer wants us to see than just that line of freeway. Eugenia has noted in the chat that just having it divvied up like this reminds us that that we have this notion of like, we're looking at the whole picture, but of course we're never getting the whole picture. We're getting something that is a moment and that is also cut off from whenever it's fully happening in 3 dimensions all the way around. Marvin, what were you gonna say?
2 things. I noticed that these 2 people sitting there are inside the fence. So they're not just observers. I think it's their car. The other thing is that all of these pictures are sort of pushing our privilege right in our face. We don't have the kind of car that burns up. We drive by this scene without knowing it's there or what it means. I think they all have that in common.
Yeah, I agree with you on the detective work of them being inside this fence. Makes me think that they got the heck out of that car. And the car's been there for a while, because if you look closely, you'll see there are some figures standing on the road who are maybe diverting traffic around. There are already other cars stopped, or maybe just stopping traffic, maybe not even diverting it, waiting for this to burn out. Or maybe these are people who are in another one of those cars that just can't get past. And I think we all want to believe we are not in the car that's going to blow up, but we don't actually necessarily know that. I will say one of the things that I found fascinating about this photo is the billboard that's now on the left-hand middle, right? Because that's another place you could have, if you're like me putting your hand over the screen, you could cut off the sort of left-hand column and still get much of this story. But I think that that billboard is important. At least I read it as important. And if you can't make it out, it says Magnolia Plantation, now open 5 miles away. So as you are driving, not in the direction the people of the flaming car were driving, but in the other direction, what's being advertised to you is plantation tourism, which we could spend many, many, many more hours talking about the implication of Magnolia Plantation. I think it's Magnolia, it definitely is plantation, being a tourist stop. Like, who is that intended for, and what is it telling us about American leisure that plantation is what I'm trying to draw you in with, as opposed to like the water slide park or things like that. Other thoughts about this photograph? Going once, going twice. I'll let you see it one more time with it. I'm trying to, without its lines. I promised 2 more poems And I don't know that we'll get through both of them, but I will read them to you, and we'll see how people are feeling. Here, now, gone. We're standing in the road looking at a dead fawn. His truck facing town, mine headed toward home. It appears to be sleeping on the double yellow, curled as if in tall grass, or on a down comforter in a video someone has posted on YouTube about her pet deer. No sign of collision or gunshot, garroting, heart attack, nothing but spots, cuteness. The name on his door means he works on the natural gas pipeline that'll run from West Virginia to North Carolina. The company that pays him has a reputation for ruin worse than syphilis. Employees have been told to stay away from locals. They stick to a hotel near the freeway with the decor I'll call modern roach. Drink there, hone boredom, look at stars. We both crouch to make sure the fawn is dead. What the fuck, he says, staring at the desert of my face where there's no rain or hope, only cactus, as I search the dry lake bed of his. He looks back at the fawn, brings his hands together as if waiting for a communion host, makes a scooping motion with his hands, then slides his eyes to the side of the road. I'm being asked to help save a dead fawn from the bonus carnage of traffic, the shredding that suggests life isn't just delicate, but deserves to be erased. We are the briefest couple, joined by common cause. Move the fawn. Oh, I can't read that line. What's the line under move the fawn?
And
We
stand
we
briefly as men
and
who have
stand-
expected loss for sentimental reasons. Then
Then
not.
nod, become ghosts of a moment we are the custodians of, holders of the unholdable, wind telling the story of itself to itself. I totally want us to get to the next poem too, which is a much shorter poem, but like quick thoughts on this one. What does it mean to tell this story that this poem is telling? It, of all the poems that we've read tonight or looked at tonight, the most narrative. What does it mean to tell this story? What does it mean to hear this story? And what do some of the specific details add to the story? Thoughts? Chuck?
I'm struck by so much of the language in this, the term, the phrase hone boredom, which is like cuts. I mean, honing to make something sharp, but that cuts me. It's so painful. The bonus carnage of traffic. Bonus carnage. And then ghosts of a moment we are the custodians of is really, to me, the key to the whole poem. That this is the moment that's in that poem is the moment of the poem itself, right? That is the tale, the moment that we are the custodians of. And now one of the custodians of that moment is sharing that with us.
Yeah, I think that really gets at that kind of question of like, what does it mean to tell this story? That having had this experience, I cannot not tell this experience. The last line is the wind, which we had the fake wind sound of the freeway in Freeway 280, but the wind telling the story of itself to itself. But also there's a story here that needs to be told to an audience beyond the observers or the participants in the moment. And that's what the speaker of the poem is doing in laying it down for us. Chris, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I was just gonna say it's about sort of an effort to say, you know, this is our job. We're part of a corporate profit world. We have nothing to do with the real world. Don't talk to the local people. Don't think that the local deer is alive. You know, be disconnected and from any nourishment of the earth. And this person is rubbing up against nourishment from the earth.
Although also conversely, this person works for a company that tells you have to move through the world that way, right? They're putting in the pipeline, do not talk to the locals. We are sticking you in the Modern Roach Hotel where you are left to hone boredom. But what we do not know anything about this person's inner life except that seeing the dead deer on the highway, they think, what the fuck? And then they get the stranger. The sensitive voice of the poem is like, why do I have to schlep this dead fawn off the road? But it is the person who works for the company with, what's the line about syphilis? A reputation for ruin worse than syphilis. That somebody who works for that company is the one who is so tender as to say, well, the fawn may be dead, but there's no reason to let its corpse be so mistreated as to be run over and run over. Marvin, what were you going to say?
I can place myself in this poem very easily because I've been a hunter, and there's this attitude toward animals and toward life that I could very easily be looking at someone who is in every way the opposite of what I am, and actually I could despise that person and what that person thinks and believes, but we do share something, and that is the respect for this life. We don't want it to be abused. We'll pick it up and move it, and then we'll go on with our lives. But there's that feeling, even as a person who kills and eats animals, that you respect the animal. I don't know why. It's part of what part of what you are. That's it.
To be a holder of the unholdable. All right, I'm going to ask you to hold on for one more poem because it's short and it's good. And also, Otto incorrected this poet's name in my program description, so I'm feeling especially like Laura Toei deserves our attention. Blue Impala. That time I stole a blue Impala in Flagstaff, the first year they made those automatic windows, you know? I was 16 and I was cruising down the highway, hot on the trail to Albuquerque. I was hungry and I was howling, man. It was like stealing the best horse in the herd. So let's start with like, what is our emotional response to this poem and how do we view that speaker, the I in the poem?
Chris?
Well, it makes me view the speaker as a person from a Native American culture where raiding horses from the other tribes is part of your way of life, of interacting with the world.
Although it is true that Laura Toei is Diné, I will point out, we think of horses, we so closely associate that with Native culture. Horses are not indigenous to the Americas. So everything we think about Native culture and horses is a post-contact aspect of Native culture, because Native culture, like all culture, is evolving over time. But yes, the stealing the horse in the herd. Marvin, what were you going to say?
Well, I got down to the bottom and I saw a woman wrote this. I was shocked. I thought there would have been a teenage guy. So I'm more interested in the poet than I am in the poem. Okay, this is an interesting woman who steals cars when they're teenagers.
All right, so I will remind you all also that the poet can be writing from a persona, right? It's not necessarily that the I in the poem is the poet, but it is certainly true that the poet has to convince us that that I makes sense, has to be able to inhabit that persona effectively. So, but it is interesting what our expectations about gender, right? Do we expect a teen girl to be a bad kid in the same way? And parenthetically, like, what do we view about this car theft? Is this like stupid teen rebellion? Is this heroic outlaw? Is this somebody you want to lock up and throw away the key? Like, what do we think about this car thief as we come to know them through this poem? Eugenia has said, freedom. I was actually cruising down the freeway. Did I say highway? I meant to say freeway in my stolen blue Impala.
Yeah, I thought that too, sort of like escape and like just taking advantage of this opportunity and unleashing just, I don't know, the possibilities in this new Impala or old Impala.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an old memory of a new Impala. And I just want to draw your attention in the same way that we give our attention to the details in the photographs, the details in the poem that create that, right? The first year they made those automatic windows, you know? So like, I think we're all, except maybe one of us, of an age that we know the difference in the moment when automatic windows became a possibility as opposed to crank down windows, right? And so I think the automatic windows add to that sense of freedom. Like you can be cruising down the highway and decide how much to put up or down your windows, which is I still have crank windows in my car. It's very hard when you're on the freeway to adjust all the windows in the car as the lone driver. You just can't do it unless you've got exceedingly long arms. So that sense of not just of freedom, but the way that we accept technology as innovative and as fostering ever more freedom for us, which it is not actually really doing. Eugenia is saying it also seems to be a more innocent time, a sense of like the joyride, right? The fact that this poem starts, that time I stole a blue Impala, right? It is a specific memory of what does feel, I think, we can read it as a joyride. And Eugenia, who I'm not going to ask whether you know this from personal experience, says, well, back in the day, car theft then might not have gone on your permanent record in the way that it does today. We won't ask for any more details about how you come to know that fact. Other thoughts about this poem? I am interested in the way we name a car after an antelope and then compare the antelope car to a horse. There's something very interesting going on about our relationship to nature and culture through that.
Well, and there was a need for the poet too to emphasize it as an Impala, not just a car, right?
Right. And I was trying to remember, was the Impala a Chevy? I think it was. Like yeah. It's different to say the time I stole a blue Chevy in Flagstaff, right? Impala, first of all, we're Americans. We got to know everything about the car. I got to know its color. I got to know the make. I got to know the model. I got to know, oh, look, the accessories, the automatic windows. And also, again, that Impala brings us back into that. We appropriate nature for the cars that are going to end up destroying every living thing on the planet. Chuck?
I'm sorry, it wasn't there for most of this talk, and I don't know if anyone's brought this up already, but the fact that he sees fit to mention the automatic windows.
We have covered it, but tell us what you think about those automatic windows.
The automatic windows somehow has to do with like stealing the speed, the sort of the smoothness of the ride. Everything was effortless, like this sort of stealing the car and the windows just going down and the wind just coming in at your 16-year-old hair. Right, that seems to be such a part of the experience.
So I will note, yeah, that it implies what we might think of in terms of cruise control. Although I can tell you that the first year that they made those automatic windows, cruise control was not an option that you could get on your Impala. And interestingly, I think I caught Chuck referring to the speaker of the poem as he. We don't know if it's a he or a she, but it's interesting that we keep reading this. Car stealing teen spirit as masculine. There's also something really interesting that is happening on the level of language in this poem. There's a repetition of sounds, and if you're muted, I invite you to read with me the second stanza, which starts with the word hot. Hot. On the trail to Albuquerque, I was hungry and I was howling, man. It was like stealing the best horse in the herd. And when you read it out loud, you also get that sound repetition of the H over and over. And like, what is the effect of all of that hot, hungry, howling, best horse in the herd on us? Just give yourself a moment. You're all muted. Just make some sounds. Hot, hungry, howling, horse, herd. What is it? What's the effect? Ken has said it's breathing and it's laughing. It's definitely exuding something. And those of you who have looked at poems with me before know I like very much to think about g sounds versus h sounds, or f sounds versus g sounds, the actual way that our body experiences sound. And I do think, as Ken has seems to be also suggesting, that there's something about the mood of this poem that the hot, hungry, howling horse in the herd is all underscoring with the way that sound feels. And I would also note that the one word in the first stanza that does that is the word highway. So it too is the breathing and the laughing, and even though it's not the word freeway, the freedom. You all have stuck in for, oh my heavens, a good long while, where it's 6:41, says my computer. Thank you all for this conversation. Is there anything else anybody wants to reflect on before we say good evening to each other and go about our business in terms of the poems and the photographs?
Well, I'm going to drive home on the freeway now. That's what I'm going to do. And I'll look around me. I will pay attention.
But not so much attention to what's around you that you're not paying attention to your driving, I hope.
Right.
To be not the opposite of a distracted driver, but a more keenly tuned in driver. And Ken, yes, you'll be delighted to know that we are going to keep doing these in the online format, at least through the end of the calendar year, and maybe beyond if we can't think of anything better to do with ourselves. It is, I think, a different thing to be able to do stuff that people can attend from all over.
Well, thank you again, Lois, for a great selection of images and poetry together.
I have to say, the highway let me run wild through the poetry. So thank you all for being part of the conversation. And we will see you on the 4th Wednesday of July, which I've already forgotten what that date is.
Yes, and I don't have that date in front of me, but it is the 4th Wednesday of July, which is, I will tell you, the 28th, the 28th of July.
So if you want to see Joshua Dudley Greer's photographs and you're in Portland, you should get yourself into the lovely, cool space of the gallery anytime between now and Saturday. And then starting July 1st, you can come in and see the 2 new shows that are up. And I don't know yet whether we'll be looking at work by both of the photographers or not. I suspect there's some, I did peek at them online, and I think there'll be some interesting juxtapositions to come. So
yeah, we're going back to 1 month shows in the gallery, so Lois has to sort of pick and choose what she will focus on. But this upcoming month in July, you might want to actually work with both images from both, but that's up to you. It's your prerogative.
Yes, who knows what wildness we'll get into, but we have a month to figure it out. Thank you all.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Thank you all. Good night. Keep cool.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Great to see you again.
Thank you all.
Mhm.